Hello, potential friends and adventurers. I'm Em, and today we're going to talk about how to have more combat options for any role-playing system. Welcome to the DM table. Now, sometimes a system doesn't give us enough combat options that we would like to have, so that our build shines, so that we can perform the things that we imagined, so that we can do the fun and interesting stuff that looks tremendous, that shapes the play, that influences the story, that makes you really feel the prowess of your character that you've worked on for such a long or short, well, usually long time, and thought up all those wondrous things that you will do, that can be done, that will be wonderful in that world, that plane of existence where you'll be playing, but the system won't let you have any of it because it's not about the power, it's about lack of fun options. Because you'd be fine at performing these at whatever the power the other person has, but you don't even get to perform any of it at half the power, or even a quarter, or even at all, really, because there's no class that fits your criteria and you can't play what you wanted to play. So, to get rid of this situation so that we can have the fun that we want and so that everybody can have fun, because this isn't about power, we'll end up having everybody be just as powerful, but we'll have also everybody have just as much fun. And mind you, when balancing power, that is more a difficult a task than this. When you're balancing fun, you just need to have people have everything they would like without breaking either the game, the system, the power levels, and without breaking the quality of how things look. And without too much overlapping, potentially, so that people don't overshadow each other. And performing fun things is easier, incredibly enough, to balance than just having the things balanced by power levels, and this is what we're gonna do. Firstly, we might want to tell everything to our players in front. All these points that I'm gonna list, we can tell our players that we'll support them and that we'll have all these so that they can plan and build towards these, because otherwise they won't know and they won't feel that now new options are open to them. So if we would like them to pick a class that they like, that they would love to play, that they would love to roleplay and raise to new heights, we want to tell them what we're gonna do to help them. Anytime you introduce a house rule, you should introduce it before the campaign. You should tell your players what and why and ask them whether they agree and how do they feel about it. In fact, to do this properly, you want to hear what your players need, what kind of class upgrades and additions do they need, so that all the classes function smoothly, that they can fulfill what they needed for their role, that their concept will now work without anything happening that's unnecessary, that would detract from the balance of the system. You want to aim towards the players' concepts and wishes, as usually, really. So for the campaigns and quests, so for the combat moves. Now, how do we start? Well, firstly, we should say that we'll encourage creative use of combat. If somebody has a good solid plan that will highly increase the success in theory of party in combat, then you don't need to make the person roll at a disadvantage or whatever. Just have them do it and roll their normal attack or whatever skill roll that's closest to it that fits with the class. Because if the fighter knows how to swing from the chandeliers because he trained swinging from ropes and so on and fighting, from the backstory, it doesn't have to be in the book for a person to have some backstory to their training. You should maybe just let them roll normal attack if the system doesn't support anything else, because this is not against the rules. This is just somebody improvising how to add a heavy object on top of the enemy along with themselves during either a move or an attack or something like that. As in, jumps on the chandelier, cuts the rope, lands on them. done and over with one roll. You don't need to penalize things that, would work, seem fun, are logical. You can introduce some minuses or a bonus or something to things that are either easier or harder depending on what they are, but don't go overboard. Just make sure things are reasonably realistic and scenic and so on. Well, scenic isn't maybe the right word, but I know how many people on the internet hate the word cinematic, but it applies here, if you will. It applies here because this is supposed to be something that we would love to see. And yes, in tabletop we get to imagine and therefore see all these things. So we want things that we can do that seem grand, that seem impressive, that just open up to new styles of play, that makes everybody go, wow, that's so cool, I didn't expect him to do that or her to do that, and that's so good, and yet I've seen it only rarely, or I've seen this many times elsewhere but not in tabletop because I've played this system for years and it never let person do this. So we should let people improvise and not pile new rules on top of the old rules to make this harder or inaccessible, or just look at the book and say, it's not in the book. Well, why do you want to do this? It's, swing, that's what you do, right? I mean, aren't you satisfied? Because some classes have hundreds of different, colorful, unique buttons to press. Other classes in the same systems might not have more than 10, and those 10 might even be made for some reason, and I don't even ever understand this in editions of D&D, for example. Why are the things that are not spells usually more rigidly written so that they are less used outside of combat, while spells are written frequently pretty nicely to be useful at any time? I mean, fire will light things on fire and stuff. Lightning is a source of electricity and so on and so forth. And nobody will ever tell you in D&D that, can't light something on fire with a fire cantrip, or that you can't, shoot a lightning to do something electrical to something. It may require sometimes finesse that you don't have, like, charging something electrical with a lightning bolt wouldn't quite work as such usually, but thing is, you can do lots of things. You can melt metal with a lightning bolt in case you need to. You can heat things. You can do many things with a couple of spells, whilst frequently moves that are made to not be spells for other classes are rigidly written, that say, when you in combat take such and such stance and are holding the shield and the rain is falling and a giant is standing in front of you and you're a halfling and your ancestors taught you a specific slingshot technique, then you may do one more die of damage and hold your shield and defend your party if they stay adjacent to you specifically. Why are these things written like that? Why don't we have actual cool fighter moves? Because we could, somebody could know how to play a fighter and write this in the next edition, pretty please. Anyways, in the meantime, what else do we do? Well, let's apply this in our terrain. Let's have more opportunities. Let's look at our terrain and let's play a game with ourselves. Let's think up how each terrain is unique and how it can be used, and then be a bit more descriptive about that. Maybe in a mine shaft there's nearly a loose beam that is supporting the wall that'll let loose boulders and rocks if pushed hard, and so if players break that beam, maybe the enemies won't like the rocks that then pile up on top of them. Hopefully the party will dodge and be safe. But anyways, maybe there are levers, maybe there are chandeliers, maybe there are barrels that you can push down the hole, or are flammable, liquid-filled, or explosive or something. Maybe there are ladders that can be pushed. Maybe there are gates that can be closed down on the enemies. Maybe there are doors that can be jammed into enemies' faces. Maybe there are slippery pieces of terrain that either ice or oil left Or maybe blood. Blood can be slippery in sufficient amounts on top of sufficiently smooth surfaces. Anyways, if you think carefully and add this frequently, you can have more descriptions for your players so as to clue them in that there is something of interest in the area that they can use in combat, and therefore more combat options for any system. Simply enough. But this is not all, because we can also have enemies demonstrate. We can have them use the same things, and then players will know better how to use them, and it will look more entertaining, and it will also be opportunity for learning. And well, then we can also have some new mystical techniques that people can train and study, and either go to a monastery and learn, or learn from their teacher and mentor or somebody else, or maybe they can create a new technique. Spell research used to be a thing in D&D from a while back, and so why not research new moves? Why not, collaborate with a person from your party to create a new mystical technique? And then suddenly fighter can actually channel lightning through their sword and shoot lightning bolt from the sword. And please don't start on that. Fighters shouldn't be spellcasters, because if we're in high fantasy, fighters should be fighters. Therefore, they should, cut a rock with a paper thin cut from 20 paces or something like that, and so on and so forth. If it's low fantasy, if you're playing Sherlock Holmes, then casters also shouldn't be able to fireball. So this should scale. This should scale pretty perfectly together. There shouldn't be a gap between the two. As such, we should keep the balance on the same level for the fun of all concerned, and keep it towards our preferred level of fantasy for the campaign set. So, mystic techniques, yeah. Maybe they learn something that lets them just outright finish off a foe on a critical. I mean, there are some spells that do similar. There certainly was many spells earlier that did things like that, but maybe if you don't want to go overboard, you should just adapt things that are sort of balanced. Because how we do this is we take a spell that won't further multiply or synergize with the rest of the build in both damage dealing ways and providing opportunity for things to trigger. We want things that will just extend usability, like giving range, therefore, evening out things with distant and flying enemies. That lightning bolt won't even do anything else except be a lightning bolt in hands of a fighter, so it won't break the fighter. And so if we put new technique that doesn't overlap with previous ones, then we won't accelerate the build beyond control. And that's how we do it. And now we can have multiple of these techniques that you can either make yourself and tell the players ahead of time that these classes will be able to get these techniques, and that they can choose from these and these essentially schools of fighting and so on and so forth. You can do that. And well, whenever a system is lacking something for one class but has it for another class, and you want to sort of more equalize them, you can flavor shift it but keep the functionality. And before somebody says that this makes for a samey, boring game, you make sure that it's interesting, that it's sufficiently differently functioning on that other person. Not because the thing functions differently, but because it's on another person and maybe has different sources of activation and so on, different conditions, different frequency, and so on and so forth. When I say different frequency, I mean, for example, maybe that fighter can do this 3 times a battle or something, but he or she doesn't have other spells and stuff like that. Not that many anyways, even if you go this route. So all these things can be carefully layered between each other so as to form something of a systematic approach to how these things are different. For example, if you state that fighter can use their techniques to cut a lock, if the rogue, say, fails to lockpick it, then no overshadowing is happening because it's desirable in most cases for the rogue to do this silently. But if there's a rush or the rogue fails, the fighter can do it, albeit more loudly, because whilst the lock will be cut neatly, it will probably create lots of noise, unless there's a reason to rule otherwise, but yes. Also, open up those existing techniques to uses outside of combat so that, you know, the person feels like they are actually contributing socially and in exploration and so on, not just in combat, because, you know, it's useful, it's good utility to have fighter be able to cut a wall down if need be. It's useful for fighter to be able to carve, say, a glass out of wood. Well, it's not, I guess, it's a cup, not a glass, but, you know, as to help somebody carry some sort of liquid or something like that. Now, I'm not saying this from level 1. You compare what feels appropriate where, in which tier of skill. Further, that fighter could be having skills in all kinds of utility work, like they know anatomy, they know how to cut up a monster so that parts can be sold the best. And yes, some classes are more fitting to this, like ranger instead of a fighter, but the next closest class applies. If you don't have a cleric to tell you anatomy, you have a fighter to tell you anatomy, and they're not gonna be that bad at it because they train at it. And so follow the logic of the backstory of the class. And then there's so much unused potential. For example, poisons exist. And when did you last run a campaign where your fighter had dozens of poisons that they could concoct, that had unique effects that could do all kinds of things, from paralysis to HP loss over time to some sort of, for example, something that mutes the enemy. They just get closure of throat from an allergic reaction, whilst everything else works. All kinds of poisons. Poisons that, you know, make somebody tell the truth. That can also be maybe even used in combat sometimes. It's gonna be even original if you pull it off. And so why not? Why not have them be able to craft their own stuff that's useful for them? Have your players be able to keep improvising. And only make things complexer when they really absolutely need to be complexer, when they strictly one-up something that exists essentially on a balanced tier within few classes. Because if something is better than something from not so optimum class, then it's fine for it to be better because you are improving the game. And yes, you can indeed do this. You are the developer for your table, for your players, so that they can play what they wanted, because otherwise they won't be able to play that because the system will restrict them. And you as the DM are the living person behind the system that can make it all work when, you know, the system itself is not alive and therefore cannot perceive what it needs to do to achieve this. And that's why tabletop is so good still in comparison to electronic games, because we can do that, and therefore we have infinity of potential quality for our adventures, whilst anything pre-made cannot. And so it wasn't too much work if we reskin several things, check with the players what they need, and have everything prepared ahead of time. We'll have what we want out of any system, well, almost any system, as long as the system otherwise works, we should be having it, and not too much work was spent. So, adventure, if you thought this was unique, you could spare a click, and I would love to hear you in the comments and see you here next week. Bye.